project organizer. I'd like to welcome all of you to join the lecture and the discussion this afternoon. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Andrey Akhmetzhanov. And Wu Yakhe老师, he will be much like us to call him in Chinese, Wu Yakhe老师. Dr. Andrey earned his PhD in mathematics and physics from Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology, Russia. And in the following 10 years, he joined several international research teams in France, Canada, and Japan. Since 2020, he has been teaching in global health at National Taiwan University. And Dr. Andrey has already published a series of data-driven analysis modeling studies of infectious disease. Today, he will share his experience on real-time analysis of emerging infectious disease outbreaks, especially the two hottest topics, COVID-19 and monkeypox. Let's welcome Dr. Andrey.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Professor Christine, for kind introduction. So as she said, I mainly came from kind of mathematical and physics background, but actually during last year's work mainly in infectious disease. So maybe some people actually work in that domain probably like 10 or 20 years, so they consider them as expert. And actually they consider me a little bit like kind of just at the beginning of my path. But I still have some experience, and today what I'm going to share with you is this topic. So it's a topic I like to do. So mainly it's a real-time analysis or real-time modeling of emerging infectious disease. And today I will illustrate this on two particular examples of COVID-19 and Mpox, or formerly as a monkeypox. And I will talk about them a little bit at the end. But at the beginning I will try to give you some perspective of what I'm doing and why it can be interesting for you. And first of all, I want to tell you why we need to know what's the emerging infectious disease, why we need to study them. And also, second of all, if we know this emerging infectious disease, then why do we need to do real-time assessment? Of course, if you know that there is some outbreak happens, then usually the cases started to grow and they go down, and probably there is nothing really interesting. But actually, imagine that you are in the middle of the outbreak and you don't know whether it would go down or it would go up. And in that case, you may wonder how to predict, at least in the short term, what's going to happen. So in that case, you arrive to this kind of real-time assessment. And real-time assessment, it's quite widely used by many public health agencies. For example, if you work in a government, you might be wondering about what would happen tomorrow and what would happen next week. So in that case, many medical officers and public health officials, they would get a task to do risk assessment. And for example, to quantify if we have this outbreak, whether this outbreak has low, moderate, or high risk for the future. And usually, as you remember, like for example, WHO, World Health Organization, they quantify this risk at subnational, national, or global level. For example, COVID-19 it was quantified as a high risk at global level, and it became a pandemic. But currently, you know, for example, there is an outbreak of Marburg virus disease in Equatorial Guinea, and at that moment it quantified as a high risk at national level, but low risk at global level. So in that case, you can see that if you want to predict this, in that case you really need to do this kind of analysis, and you need to apply some mathematics to do your risk assessment. So from practical point of view, it's helpful, and usually there are people who work on it, and usually the government first of all try to do this. And also because of COVID-19, some mathematicians also try to do the analysis and to help the government to do this. And first of all, I will start why we call in some infectious diseases emerging and why they are interested. By definition, emerging infectious disease, or EID, it's a disease that appears in a geographic area of population for the first time. So for example, here in Taiwan, if we would have some new diseases that are not common to this area, then usually we would call it as an emerging infectious disease. But also you may encounter another definition as a re-emerging infectious disease. And in that case, it's often referred to diseases that are kind of forgotten. And for example, measles can be forgotten because it was quite common before, but now because of the vaccination, we may have some sporadic cases on it. And before that, this disease was thought to be controlled, but then at some moment they appear again. And in that case, sometimes people call it as an emerging disease or emerging disease to be more precise. And several years ago, WHO actually characterized and introduced the term of so-called disease X. And actually it was before COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2. And at that time, WHO characterized this disease as some potential threat, future threats, or emerging pathogens that would appear at one moment and would become pandemic. So at the time, you can see that WHO was quite accurate, and we indeed saw SARS-CoV-2 in recent years. But at the time, I also remember that I saw, for example, one tweet post where they rank different infectious diseases depending on a potential threat. And at that time, I also saw that Zika virus was also ranked as one of the possible future threats. And indeed, we had the Zika virus, and we had the outbreak in Brazil, which was very dangerous. And after that, we indeed had COVID-19 that appeared later. But still, even after COVID-19, we still have disease X as some kind of non-specific disease, which would give us a message that we need to be prepared and to know that potentially in the future we may encounter some disease that we don't know yet. And as I said, it's SARS-CoV-2 that appeared in 2020 and more precisely in December 2019. And you probably heard this year that avian influenza started to be considered as a very likely, unfortunate next disease that may threaten the public and global health. For example, avian influenza this year, it shows that it can infect not only birds, but it can also efficiently spread between different mammals. And many hosts among these mammals were not previously recorded. For example, about 2 weeks ago in Hokkaido in Japan, there was one report about infection of the red fox, and it was known that the red fox usually was not infected lethally by avian influenza. So currently, we may again see some alarm for many public health officials about this potential threat. And what we need to do is, of course, try to get prepared and to know how to respond. But if we look on some previous examples, and of course we may say that one of the emerging infectious diseases, we may say it was originally HIV or AIDS. And you can see that according to the estimate, more than 6 million confirmed cases and more than 40 million deaths. And currently, we may say that HIV can be controlled, and you know that antiviral treatment can control the viral load in infected individuals. And also there was several examples when people were declared HIV-free after treatments. So potentially this virus can be controlled, and the spread is also can be controlled by human, but still it represents a big burden to both public health and also economic of any country. And the second example is, of course, the SARS-CoV-1 that appeared in 2022 and quickly spread. And if you would compare this HIV and SARS-CoV-1, you can see that the number of confirmed cases by several others less. So it was about 8,096 confirmed cases, and it included nearly 800 deaths. And it's interesting, SARS-CoV-2 usually, of course, it's from the same family and it's aligned with the SARS-CoV-1. But for SARS-CoV-1, many people say that that disease could spread the global pandemic. But fortunately, it did not, because actually it was people learned how to prevent and how to stop the spread of this disease. Mainly, you remember that SARS-CoV-1 was characteristic by its post-symptomatic spread. So it means that any person who would get infected with this virus, this person would begin to be infectious only experience the first initial symptoms. And this is very different from SARS-CoV-2 because SARS-CoV-2 can be spread pre-symptomatically or even asymptomatic. So for SARS-CoV-1, you can see if you're public health officials, then you can see, okay, we can isolate all people who experience symptoms, and in that case, it would be a very efficient strategy to control the spread. And the next one is a pandemic strain of influenza, H1N1, and you remember that in 2009 it also caused a global pandemic. And actually, if you would count the number of cases, it would be also millions, and probably also many thousands of hospitalization and deaths. And you can see that still, even if this influenza was smaller scale than SARS-CoV-2, but still it was quite dangerous spread. And again, similarly to SARS-CoV-2, even though many people were mild and did not experience a severe course of the disease, but we still need to remember that the most vulnerable people, so it's immunocompromised or elderly, they actually were more prone to this disease than many others. And the last example that I want to tell is, of course, the Ebola viral disease. So it's also considered as an emerging infectious disease. And we know that there are several outbreaks, and the largest one was in 2014, and I think 2013 in Western Africa, which caused several thousands of deaths. And currently we still have this threat, and it still emerges in many countries around the world. And currently there is, for example, one ongoing outbreak, and previously just one outbreak was stopped in last year in Uganda. Why it can be stopped? Because Ebola viral disease, currently there are two main strains, so Sudan virus and Zaire virus. And for Zaire virus, we have an efficient vaccine which can work. So by using the targeted campaign, we can actually try to control and to prevent the spread of the disease. And then what is interesting is that last year there was an outbreak of Ebola viral disease in Uganda. And during that outbreak, the government implemented the lockdown similar to SARS-CoV-2. And actually, because of the lockdown, the spread of the disease was efficiently stopped. So you can see that on this example, actually not only vaccination can be used, but like for SARS-CoV-2, we can use also different strategies. So if you talk about this emerging infectious disease, then and I understood that my main auditory is people who work in mathematical biology or in mathematics and other related fields. So you can see that in that case, if you would study any of this disease, you may study first the so-called counterfactual scenarios. What would happen if you would not do this in this way? And then what would be the burden of the disease if you would do something wrong or something correct? And from another side, on this Ebola viral disease, you can also think that you can either try to optimize the vaccination of individuals. So in that case, I may ask if I want to vaccinate everyone, but then if I don't have enough vaccine doses, then I need somehow to develop more efficient strategies to vaccinate people. So for Ebola viral disease, as I said, the number of vaccine doses were not enough. So usually people use so-called targeted vaccination campaign, which targets ring vaccination. So it means that you would vaccinate all close contacts of infected people, And also you would vaccinate, for example, healthcare workers who work with the patients. And it was shown that in that case, it's quite efficient to prevent the spread of the disease, and it was used for all viruses. But you may imagine that again, if this viral disease unfortunately was spread globally and would threaten the public health to many others, of course in that case to apply this ring vaccination would not be efficient, but probably to introduce some more broad vaccination would be more efficient. So as a researcher, you might think that, again, in that case, you need to think about what kind of vaccination you need to use in the public. And the last example I didn't tell, so it's known as Zika virus, which was spread in many in South and Central America. But of course, there are many other diseases, and of course, it's MERS. And many people rank Nipah virus, which usually transmitted from fruit bats, and as a very high threat in the future. But currently, also we have Marburg viral disease that is spreading in one of the countries in South Africa, or in Central Africa, Equatorial Guinea. And also we should not forget about COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, about which I will talk a bit later. So this is, in that case, I will talk about emerging infectious disease, but you may again think that emerging infectious disease, sometimes you may call also about emerging infectious disease. And indeed for influenza, you remember that we had the pandemic in the beginning of 20th century. And then at the end of the 20th century, it was, in 2009, it was this pandemic. So again, in that case, you may see that influenza can be also quantified as a re-emerging infectious disease. But
Re-emerging infectious disease, of course, we may also recall many names. And one of the most dangerous, which is considered now, is, of course, tuberculosis or TB. And TB is a bacterial disease that is transmitted by bacteria. And it's still considered as a major global health concern. And in recent years, more and more attention paid to this disease because in many countries, there is an emergence of so-called drug-resistant TB. And then in that case, in case of drug-resistant disease, you can see that because the treatment stopped working, so it makes more challenging to treat and control the spread of disease. And another example is measles, which is highly contagious viral disease. And currently we have sporadic cases. And you probably heard that this year Taiwan reported first imported cases of measles, which happened probably 2 weeks or 3 weeks, 2 weeks ago, I think. And for example, one island in Pacific American Samoa currently declares the emergency of because of measles, and as I remember, many cases reported there. So it's still because of lower vaccination rates and because of the pandemic. Currently, there is even higher risk that this disease would reemerge in the near future. But of course, we may also cite many other examples like malaria, cholera, dengue fever, or currently Mpox. Here we might call it as a emergent and also re-emerging disease, because Mpox actually was known from 1970s, 1980s, and it caused actually some outbreaks in Africa. But probably because of shifting in epidemiology and also because of the waning immunity from smallpox, now we have a global outbreak that emerged in 2022. And of course, polio and pertussis, among other examples. And mainly, if we would talk about what causes all this infectious disease to emerge or re-emerge, and people talk a lot about this, but and they mainly call the main drivers that lead to emerging of infectious disease. And one of the main one I would call is, of course, the climate change. So because of the climate change, some organism, or including the human, we are arriving on some kind of uncomfortable zone where the spread of the disease could be more favored. But also because of the urbanization and also socioeconomic factors, there is a higher frequency of contact between human and wildlife. So in the case, because the contact has increased, then there is a higher risk of spillover from wildlife to humans. But if we would think about how to control this and how to prevent the disease, then usually people may think of this diagram. And usually you can see that on the bottom we would have some kind of emerging, so possible spillovers from wildlife to humans, which are in red, or maybe to domestic animals. And very often the spillover occurs first to the domestic animals, where the virus can amplify its ability to spread, and then there is also spillover to the humans. Or vice versa, there is a spillover directly from wild animal to humans. And you can see that from this diagram that actually spillovers are quite common. Many of them do not result in high spread among human population, but unfortunately there are some spillovers actually that lead to successful spread among humans. For example, again, if we talk about Marburg virus disease that currently is spreading in Equatorial Guinea, that one of the largest outbreak happened in Angola, I think. And in that case, during that outbreak, you remember that the case fatality rate was about 80%. But actually, this initial spillover and spillover also during the outbreak was linked to the gold miners. And again, because of this contact, this spillover was possible, and finally the disease spread also among humans. And you can see that if you work in a public health agency, or you're a researcher who tried to protect and to prevent the future spillover to humans, then of course you need to design some programs to monitor these spillovers. And probably you may try to sample some virus among the wildlife, or to catch some vectors. And also you need to monitor this virus among the domestic animals. And this makes actually quite difficult task, because first of all you need to monitor and to select the viruses that are extremely dangerous for humans and has an ability to spread. So it's kind of finding some needle in a stockpile, so it can be quite difficult. But people try to do this, and if we don't do this, then of course we may not know where we can get the next future threat. And now, if we have this emerging disease, and you can see that sometimes you want to prevent, but what if the outbreak happens? Then usually people try to do so-called real-time assessment of the risk of the spread. And this is one of the topics that I like to work. And now I want to explain why actually we need to do this real-time modeling. And the real-time modeling is that I would start just with a general picture, and then if, for example, if we look on any outbreak or epidemic that happen among human, then usually you may quantify this outbreak on several stages. And sometimes you can see that there is the stage 1 when the outbreak started to grow, and usually it's linked either to the spillover from for example, from wild animal, if we talk about, for example, Ebola or Marburg virus disease, or for example, it may link to importation. If we talk about, for example, measles, then usually we talk about the imported cases, and then, for example, some traveler who traveled from one country to another. And then if unfortunately this initial case was not caught and was not prevented, then we may have some phase of the stochastic growth. So in that case, we may have some not so many cases, and then sometimes we may see some kind of multi-generational structure. So you can see that, for example, one case appear here, and then we have small spike here, and then small spike here, and then small spike here. But at some moment, this stochastic growth may become, people would say, more deterministic. And in that case, we may see that the cases would start to grow over time quite rapidly. And then usually the government reacts at that moment. So in that case, for example, we may introduce some control measures and try to prevent further spread. So in that case, we may see some stabilization of the cases, and finally the epidemic would fade out at the end, and we may not have cases in the future. Sometimes this stabilization or this decline in cases is linked to control measures when the government reacts, but of course it doesn't happen all the time. And for example, if the disease either is very mild, and in that case we may not be very concerned about consequences, or for example, if the transmission network is really not very big. So in that case, sometimes we may see the decline of cases not because of the control measures, but simply because of the depletion of susceptibles. So simply many people become infected at one moment, they become immune. So in that case, we would see the decline of cases simply because there are not so many people who can get infected at that moment. But at the end, when many people got immune, either because of the infection or, for example, because of vaccination, and that, in that case, we would see the decline of cases, and then we would have very low number or probably no more cases. But then again, this epidemic cycle may start again with some importation or because of the waning immunity, and then we would see some picture which would be quite resembled to this one. And in that case, people would say that the disease would become endemic. So it means that we would still have a non-zero incidence even if we do not have many susceptibles around. And usually in infectious disease, people characterize different scales of outbreaks relatively to the emerging disease. And sometimes I would say about outbreaks or spillovers at the beginning, but then if outbreak started to become like large scale, and in that case I would talk about the epidemic, and after that they would talk about the pandemic if the disease would spread globally. But you can say that this definition are not very rigorous, and there is no real threshold between outbreak, epidemic, or pandemic. And sometimes it involves some kind of personal evaluation of the disease. But of course, we may introduce some kind of threshold between this and then to follow this definition to define epidemic or pandemic or just outbreak. And as I said, that sometimes the disease may continuously present in a region and in population, and in this case I would say that diseases become endemic. For example, currently the SARS-CoV-2 is endemic in Taiwan because we may see up and downs from time to time, and we cannot stop, and we cannot see zero cases. So in that case, people would become infected and maybe reinfected in the future simply because the disease is spread and we cannot stop it. And if we can stop it, then we might talk about the elimination of the disease. An example can be, for example, polio. For example, Taiwan is polio-free, and we don't have the disease. But again, because of the importation, at one moment we may face the disease again. So because of that, Taiwan should implement probably some vaccination against polio and continue this. And then sometimes, of course, we may be successful. We may eradicate and to get the disease extinct. The very first example of course, the smallpox that was eradicated because of the vaccination in 1980. And this represents one of the few examples when the eradication was really successful. But you can see that if you work in this domain, then depending on the scale of the outbreak and also on which side and which phase you are, then you may face different problems. So for example, if we have some emerging disease, then you might, if you're a mathematician, then you might calculate what's the probability of having a big outbreak. Yes, so in that case you would apply some mathematics. If you're in a phase of epidemic, you may wonder if you would see many cases tomorrow or you would not see many cases tomorrow. So in that case you need somehow to predict or to do short-term forecast. And if you're close to extinction or eradication or elimination, you may try to find out what's the probability of having the end of the outbreak. So in that case, again, it would be a bit different mathematics. And in this domain, usually people try to operate with different quantities. And during this series of lecture last year, and I think maybe last week also Jonathan talked about it a little bit. But sometimes people operate mainly with a so-called reproduction number. So it's a quantity that characterizes how many secondary infections per primary case I may expect during this epidemic. And this number can be either fixed, and in that case it's called like basic reproduction number. So it means that if I introduce one infected individual in a fully susceptible population, then how many secondary infections on average I may expect. But then if we have some interventions and or our epidemic is going on, then I may wonder about this, how this reproduction number changes in time and what's the value of this reproduction at the moment. And you can see that it may be important because if reproduction number is either above 1 or below 1, then it may represent two different situations. In the first situation, when the reproduction number is above 1, so it means that the disease is spreading and growing, and this represents quite danger. But if the reproduction number falls below 1, in that case, it means that on average, every infected individuals produces less than one secondary case. So sooner or later, this epidemic would go to low numbers, so it would fade out. But again, even if you work in the public health, you can see that if your reproduction number is 0.9 or your reproduction number is 0.3, this is two different situations. And you could experience this during the SARS-CoV-2. If the reproduction number is about 0.9 or 0.8, so in that case you would still have declining epidemic, but the tail would be quite fat. So it means that you would still have some burden of the disease on the healthcare system. But of course, if you would have this reproduction number 0.3, then in that case the number of cases would decline quite fast. And in that case, of course, you may weak the burden of the disease on the health system. And sometimes people also operate, and Professor Jonathan Dushoff talked about this last week, I think. So it's kind of represents like the strength and speed of the epidemic. So the reproduction number represents about how many secondary infections produced for primary case. But you may also think about how fast the secondary infections produce per primary case. And in that case, you might talk about the serial interval or generation time. You probably remember his example about the buses, that you might wait 10 minutes or 5 minutes. So again, in that case, you might think that, for example, if influenza has a serial interval about 2-3 days, then the epidemic would be quite fast. But of course, we would talk about Ebola or about Marburg disease, where this serial interval can be around 2 weeks. Then of course we may expect that the epidemic would be quite slowly growing. Or if you would look, for example, on acute hepatitis A, for example, in that case the serial interval can be long, or TB, tuberculosis. In that case the serial interval can be actually the order of months or weeks, which would be quite different. And then mainly what people do, if they work in this domain, they try to estimate the effective reproduction number, and also try to estimate the serial interval. And you might guess that there are many ways to do it, and not only one, but you can apply some mathematics. The main reason is that if you do this mathematics and then you try to estimate how the disease spread at the moment, the main outcome of your prediction would be also a little bit like what would be going on in the future. And of course, if you would impose some wrong assumptions, and you would impose, for example, a wrong model, then of course this would lead to some wrong prediction for the future. And in that case, for example, if you work with some government, then the government may be a little bit not believing you next time. So in that case, you need to somehow to develop some robust methods that would provide some rational answers. But of course, there are different sides for this. And for example, in public health, there was some discussion recently saying that sometimes if you would predict that the threat is very dangerous and we would expect many cases, in that case, the public health and people would listen to you. But if you would predict that maybe the disease is not very dangerous, then maybe it would lead actually to some opposite outcomes and can be also dangerous. And then what I do in my research is usually, as I said, the real-time modeling. So again, a real-time analysis. So again, if you would have this, for example, this epidemic, and at one moment you can see that this cases started to decline. And the main question, if you would put yourself here, then how would you predict what would happen in the future? And whether we would expect this outbreak, which is quite big, or maybe after this very lucky moment there would be no other cases, and in that case we may think, oh, actually it was very small outbreak and not very dangerous. And why this real-time modeling become important? It became important even before SARS-CoV-2, because for example, before SARS-CoV-2, people also tried to predict the influenza, the epidemic size during this season. And for example, in that case, this example comes from US. And usually the number of so-called influenza-like illnesses, they are reported by the government. But actually, if you look on a given report, then you may find out that you don't know exactly how many cases happened in this week and then in the previous week. Simply because some people who experience this, the influenza, they are not yet confirmed. So they are not yet reported. And in that case, people try to, in that time, people also try to adjust this. And actually, if you would adjust for this reporting delay, in that case, you might try to predict actually how many cases we indeed have this week and the previous week without the need to wait for another 1-2 weeks in order to know how many cases we had. And in that case, people would talk about so-called nowcasting. So in that case, I might try to predict what happens now by nowcasting. And sometimes if I construct this, I may also wonder what would happen in the future. And in that case, people would talk about forecasting. So you can see when we do the real-time assessment or real-time modeling, in that case, our main challenge would be to predict what is happening today based on the given information, which is not complete. And also using this data to try to predict what would happen in the future. And of course, the dynamics can be quite stochastic. And for example, for influenza, it's very difficult to predict before, at the beginning of the outbreak, so before the peak. But at least using this information, I may wonder about what would be the epidemic size for this given season, and also what would, so the epidemic size, so the peak intensity, and when this peak actually arrive. So you can see that for the public health official, it would be very important when it would arrive. For example, whether it would arrive during the Christmas or a little bit later, and also how big it would be. And of course, you cannot predict the exact dynamics, but you may wonder about the prediction. And this kind of exercise, it led many groups to develop different models and in order to do forecasts. And actually, it led to the very big subfield of infectious disease, which is called like the forecasting exercise. And this is one of the main tasks for real-time analysis. And now I want to focus on particular how to perform the nowcasting and why it can be difficult. And for example, this small illustration shows the epidemic in Tokyo in Japan in 2020 for SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. And again, you can see that we had at the time there was a first wave, and then there was starting the second wave. And in that case, you may record all these numbers, but you may also expect, again, because of the reporting delay, you may expect that actually at the end you would not know some cases, so your data would not be complete. And if you have this data, you may even see this from your data directly. Suppose that you have some line list of cases, so you know many people when they get illness onset, which is here the date of illness onset on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis you may put the delay between their symptom onset and confirmation. Why this confirmation can be so long? Because you remember in 2020 it was mainly PCR tests. So in that case, the case should go to see a doctor, and after the doctor, this case may be arranged for the testing in some special facility. And when this case gives the test to would do the test in the special facility, there would be again few days delay before the results come out. And finally, after this result come out, then this result would go to the surveillance system, to the reporting system, and then finally some public health official would input this result to the system. And finally, there would be some delay, even 1 or 2 days before this case would be finally notified to the public. So you can see that this delay can be quite complex. And at the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, these delays could be about 10 days or 2 weeks. And you can see that suppose that I have this data and I have this first wave, and now the second wave arrives. And again, I can see that many cases have reds here, but also in this empty domain, I may expect that there are many cases which are not yet reported, but they happen. And this is the main task of the nowcasting, that I may try to formulate some model in order to predict how many cases would happen here. And then once I can get it, then I can try to project what's the real size, what's the real incidence at the moment. And then by doing this, actually, I can be able to do this delay adjusted reproduction number. And again, if you would do this, you would see that, for example, from this graph, the reproduction number, which is shown in blue, indeed this reproduction number become quite high, about 2. And in that case, I may expect that maybe the Tokyo government should be really worried in the near future, and we may expect more cases. And in that case, the government should prepare the healthcare to handle this spike of cases. So this one particular application and why it's important. And why it's another example probably from the past. And actually at the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, when some public health, or not public health, but some politician in Taiwan did a similar mistake, is that very often if we would look on the, as I said, on the overall outbreak, then we might see that the outbreak can be big and the cases would continue to grow. But actually if you look on any particular point, then we would always see that the cases would decline. And this decline would be simply linked because many cases are not yet reported to the system. So if someone would not really realize this, then this person would always think that the cases would decline, and then we should not worry much about. But again, as you could see from my slides, in that case you probably need to be worried, and then you need to think about how to predict, and how, for example, to predict that actually we don't have 0 cases here, but actually we have some cases. And historically, this exercise was actually linked to HIV or AIDS epidemic. And at the time, you probably remember that the cases, actually the reporting delay can be even longer. And for example, from this plot, you can see that the cases reported by 1988, which this line, and 1990, this line. So you can see that many cases were not yet reported, and then we actually had an increase of cases. And again, if you don't account for this, then you might see that, oh, we have this decline, so probably the epidemic would go down after that, but actually it goes up simply because we don't account for many cases. But this example was one of the first examples when this adjustment was done by researchers, and then it was considered as important. And just one more example, for example, for plague epidemic in Madagascar in 2017. Again, the government reported the cases, but you can see that initially we might have like smaller outbreak, but actually when we move further, then our outbreak also continue to grow. So in that case, this adjustment for the reporting data can be very important. And sometimes it's quite challenging to do this adjustment. It's not very definitive, and sometimes actually even the cases that are reported that can be corrected in the future. And one of the particular example of for Ebola outbreak in DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo. And you remember in 1918 they experienced the outbreak there in North Benin, and it was a conflict outbreak. And you remember that because of this conflict, actually surveillance system was not very precise, and in that case the disease spread between different regions, so different regions were affected. But actually if you look on the epidemic curve, you can see that the case is actually quite, it's not the I would say it was not a deterministic growth, but actually it was kind of very stochastic growth. And actually you can see that the disease spread between different regions, and we may see that there was one outbreak first in Beni, and then it's spread to Katwa Butembo, where we had a big outbreak, and then again it spread to Beni and also Mabalako, so it's kind of the second wave, and at the end it also started to spread to some other regions. And actually after that it was stopped. But what I want to illustrate here is that if we would look on how many cases were reported, so again suppose that here it's my snapshot, and this is the date of illness onset. So first of all I would look on this date, and then what I would see that there is a big outbreak here. And actually if you look on the official reports, then you would see that actually your cases kind of jump up and down. So it means that this case is becoming even corrected because the surveillance system was under pressure, and also, as I said, there was a active conflict there. So there was even more uncertainty that happened over the case. So if you work on mathematics, you can see that this become quite challenging task to estimate all these reporting outbreaks, and actually to estimate whether the disease would spread or not. And indeed, what people knew about this kind of nowcasting, that it's extremely difficult to predict the size of the outbreak before the epidemic peaked. So it's very difficult to say how many cases got infected. For example, again in that case you can see that we didn't have many cases, and then it's extremely probably difficult to predict this number of cases. But once the peak gone, then maybe it's become much more easier to predict the size of the outbreak. And indeed, when I tried to do it, as I said that at the beginning, you can see on this particular outbreak, the researcher tried to do nowcasting, and you can see that the uncertainty is very large. But then when the peak passes, then of course we may predict the number of cases with greater certainty. And of course, when there is kind of decline of cases, then it's becoming much more easier. So from a mathematical point of view, you see that there is some methodology to do this, and you may say, okay, if the peak, when it's passed, then it's become not extremely important. It would be very nice to know at the beginning. And that's why it's one of the priority actually to develop some kind of models that would be able to predict quite well what is going on at the beginning or before or during the peak. And this is some methodology to do this. And here maybe I will skip this several slides, and maybe you can look on them later. But as I said, by doing the nowcasting, actually you try to estimate the distribution of reporting delays. So, and in that case, you can try to do it to do some mathematics. But actually, what it means that the cases that you see today on a given day, they're kind of weighted by the cumulative distribution of the reporting delay. So, for example, if I know that the reporting delay is just 1 day, imagine the situation. And today, all of a sudden, I see like 10 cases, for example, of mpox. And in this case, I may, if I know that the reporting delay is very long, and today I already see 10 cases, then of course I may expect that there are actually many cases out there. And mathematically, of course, what you can do is kind of weight by the cumulative distribution for the reporting delay. And this was done, and actually this formula is quite classical, and sometimes it's called like a frequentist nowcasting. And people try to elaborate more and to develop more difficult problems, or more difficult formulas, and actually it's possible to do. But one of the limitation of this method that suppose that today I don't see 10 cases of mpox, but I see 0 cases. And in that case, it's very difficult to predict how many cases out there, because I have just 0. And this frequentist approach to lead, it would lead to some kind of predictions that today probably there would be not nowcasted not so many cases. But actually, if I would have more cases for the reports tomorrow and 2 days after that, then I can predict it in more precision. And for example, last year, Professor Shen Holin presented my results, or not my results, sorry, our results, and in that case we used a frequentist approach, and you can see that there was this drop in cases simply because of limitation of this methodology. And recently, about 2 years ago or 1 year ago, there was a group of people who actually showed that sometimes we don't need really to model particularly this reporting delay. I mean, we need to model. But actually, if we would try simply to do some kind of random walk for the incidence, and I may also impose that today I may expect this number of cases which would not be very different from yesterday. So in that case, I would impose some kind of random walk for this expected incidence. Then actually what people show that this simple formulation can even lead to better predictions comparing to this frequentist approach. And if we do this, then this kind of limitation could be overcome. And in that case, we would predict that even for 0 cases today, I might predict how many cases actually out there. And this was done, and actually our team, we tried to communicate with Taiwan CDC, and we were lucky to do this. So Taiwan CDC tried to use this estimates actually to assess the spread of SARS-CoV-2 in Taiwan. And for example, in this slide, I show some of the of the presentations. And of course, by doing this nowcasting, we may predict the reproduction number, and also we may predict a little bit what is going on, what's going to be happen in the future. And again, it's not the case at the moment, but you remember that in 2021, especially in August, after the that big outbreak of alpha variant, in that case, I mean, we started to talk about how to assess whether we can end and reach zero incidence in some counties. And in that case, actually, we even tried to calculate what would be the end of outbreak probability for each particular county. And this is the main topic what we tried to work. And actually, you can see that if you would do this kind of real-time analysis, then you may arrive to this kind of different parts of the analysis. So first, it can be what's the probability of having big outbreak. Then you might talk about what's the actual size of the outbreak and try to do the nowcasting, and then to predict what kind of what would happen a little bit in the future. And at the end, you might also wonder what would be the probability that actually there is no more cases to be declared. But you also can be wonder about analysis of retrospective analysis about when this outbreak already happened, then whether the government actually did things well, did things efficiently, or actually there was some unfortunate mistakes and some misdoing by, not exactly by the government, but probably by handling this outbreak. And you know, it's good to be also kind of objective and try to look and to reflect on what kind of lesson we can learn from the outbreaks. And in that case, the main topic what you arrive at is that usually the government introduces some interventions. And for example, in the case for SARS-CoV-2, we had several non-pharmaceutical interventions, and you remember as many was characterized by level 2, level 3 of this intervention. So it was not complete lockdown, but for example, the social gatherings were cancelled, and also some working hours were shortened. Some people would not go to work and stay home, which was called like work from home strategy. So in that case, you may wonder how this measures were efficient. So you want to estimate the efficiency of these measures. But again, if you look from the mathematical point of view, and what I try to explain you, that usually we may have this number of cases by the reporting date, but you could see that the reporting delay could be around 1 week. So actually this reflection can be kind of delayed from the actual epidemic situation. And also when I introduce this intervention, what actually I affect people is by their date of infection, not by the date of reporting. But actually, for example, if I introduce a lockdown and I experience symptom of SARS-CoV-2 yesterday, then even if this lockdown was introduced, it would not affect my status. I would be still infected. So in that case, of course, a characterization of my infection would come late. And by the consequence of this, that if I would infected just before that, then my case would be reported after introduction of the level 3. And actually, if I would just estimate by the reporting delay, in that case, I would not be able to estimate the real effect, the real impact of intervention on the epidemic dynamic. And second limitation that if I would consider this reporting delay, and you may see that here we have a lot of cases at the beginning, it's simply because the outbreak was discovered. And the Taiwan CDC implemented the active case finding and contact tracing, and they were able to identify several clusters. And at the time, simply because of that, there was a reported like two orders more of cases comparing just before that. And I remember at the time some people tried to estimate again this reproduction number, and what it leads to this effect that this reproduction number was skyrocketing. So from reproduction number of around 2, this reproduction number become around 10. Simply, it did not reflect the fact that actually there was an extreme spread of the disease, but simply the fact that the outbreak was discovered by the government. So if you're a researcher and if you work in this field, of course you don't want to offer some non-realistic estimate, but you may wonder about actually how to estimate this reproduction number and how to link this reproduction number to the interventions. And from the mathematical point of view, in that case, what we try to do is we may try to estimate the reproduction number by date of infection, and then there is a method to do it. And then we may see that we may think that this reproduction number was constant before the intervention, and then stepwise it changed to some new value, and then we may look how much it was changed. So this is what we tried to do at the time. And when we linked this, we could see that actually indeed the reproduction number was quite high at the beginning. And you remember at the time the initial outbreak was linked to tea houses in Wanhua district, so it was a very high risk environment, and people were, for example, were not wearing the mask simply because of the occupation and services. But then you can see that once the intervention was introduced, and especially after strengthening the intervention, the reproduction number was below 1, around 0.7. So in that case, actually, the intervention worked. And you might wonder why, for example, after introduction of the very first interventions, actually the reproduction number didn't fall below 1. And here I might say that actually, even if we do this analysis, it's still limiting, because we have very limited data. We have just data like timeliness data, and we have only case numbers. So if we want to impose some causality in that case, of course we need to provide some more detailed analysis and more complicated analysis, and here we may also only speculate. But this speculation can be done, for example, you remember that when this level 2 and the first level was introduced, first the time difference is very short, so it's very difficult to say. And second, you remember that introduction of these levels imposed some so-called panicking in buying things. So people actually rushed to the markets and to the grocery stores, and then probably because of that, actually the reproduction number will not really fell down below 1. But again, if we talk about this, and we need to be very careful. And again, there should be some more precise assessment for this. And unfortunately, I think we don't have this data to do this assessment even now. And then if you do this analysis, you might wonder about, as I said, kind of counterfactual scenarios. So you might wonder, for example, if you introduce the interventions either earlier or later, then how many cases can be averted, or how many more cases you can expect. And at the time, by doing this analysis, we were able to show. So it's simply like you shift the intervention by a few days before and few days after, and then you introduce the same reproduction number and look how many cases resulted. Of course, this is very, again, a little bit limited analysis, because of course if we would see a lot of cases after, then the government would probably introduce level 4. So in that case we would expect some changes, and also people would change also if we would have many more cases. But you can see from this graph that actually, and what we show, that the government actually introduce the intervention more or less optimally, or more or less efficiently. But if the government would introduce the interventions maybe 3 days later, then we could expect that there could be even the size of the outbreak could be like twice larger. But from another side, if they would introduce these interventions earlier, then of course we would expect less cases. But you can see that maybe if the cases would not be as much as this one, then maybe the response from the public would not be as strict as it was done during this outbreak. But at least in that case, in this mathematical analysis, we may give some clue about what would happen if we would change a little bit or not do this at the time, but do it a little bit earlier. But you can see that, and I think that the government at the time acted in kind of optimal way and actually introduces intervention in the right time. And at the time, actually, as I said, when we want to introduce some causality, in that case, we may wonder about some other covariates. And one of the covariates that we tried to introduce was actually the Google, not the Google, but the mobility of individuals. And at the time, you remember that the Google provided the mobility metrics between different types of residents, the transit action, workplace, and so on. And of course, what you can try to do in that case, you might try to see what's the prediction of the reproduction number given the change in one of these metrics. And we try to do this, and actually it's possible to do, for example, using this formula. And in that case, what we discovered is that actually the Google mobility predicted the reproduction number quite well. And in that case, we would see this decline, which was quite similar to if we would estimate the reproduction number without these covariates. But one of the outcomes was actually at the end, when the level 3 was downgraded to level 2, the mobility would still grow, but actually the reproduction number would stay below 1. And then the reason why it happened is that because the number of cases was small enough, in that case the government was able to prevent the spread in a better way, to do like contact tracing and case finding. And you remember that Taiwan CDC really did this. And in that case, the reproduction number was held below 1, even though the mobility increased and people will start to go to work again. And this was our analysis, and again, as I said, if we would actually use the mobility as one predictor and would keep the baseline reproduction number the same, in that case, actually, our mobility would predict actually the growth of reproduction number and the growth of cases, which was not actually the case in COVID-19. And then, again, by doing this, as I said, that reporting delay was quite important because many cases were not yet, they would experience symptoms and they were not yet reported, but also many cases were not, many cases did not have the symptom onset in their data. So what it means that when we analyze this outbreak, we would need also to back project these cases, and these cases can be back projected by the reporting delay. So this is also importance of this kind of analysis. And now I will move, I will talk a little bit about Mpox outbreak that currently happened, which was known by the formerly as a monkeypox. But I want to ask if you have any questions, maybe you can ask. But if you don't mind, I will make 1 minute break for water. maybe I can ask.
Oh, okay. Is there any question about the COVID-19 part from the audience? Please don't hesitate to raise your hand. Or the audience, for the audience online, you can leave your message on the message board. If there is no immediate question, then we continue.
But thank you. So I drank some water, so it's good. And some students woke up, so it's also good. So. And so the last topic what I wanted to talk about is the outbreak of Mpox. And this outbreak is currently growing as in the Western Pacific region. So for example, in South Korea and Japan and Taiwan, in all these countries we have increasing number of cases in recent weeks. And monkeypox, it's a former name, and actually, as I said, it was very well known even before, and it was known from 1970s. And it was known that this disease causes usually mild symptoms, and it has a lower fatality rate. People knew about the disease for a long time, and actually they considered it as a public health threat. And the reason was that this disease was considered as kind of replacement of the smallpox, because it's from the same family, and even genetically these two viruses are similar. And that's why we have cross protection from the smallpox vaccine. But it was known for a long time, and actually it caused also outbreaks outside of endemic countries in Africa. It was there was a big outbreak in US in 2003. So it was all known, but even with these facts, this global outbreak in 2022, it caught many people by surprise. And the question why it happened and what kind of how large this outbreak can be expected is the main question on agenda. And I know that Mpox usually causes the rash, and here is some few examples. But for 2022, what was known that the epidemiology of this disease was shifted, and actually what was revealed that the disease was able to spread efficiently with a sexually associated transmission route. Before it was probably also the opportunity, but in 2022 the disease found a way to spread efficiently in a sexual network of men who have sex with men, and it was a main driver for the spread of the disease. And what people show that actually this disease has very limited transmission potential among other transmission routes. And for example, this disease may transmit less efficiently outside of this sexual network. And this disease causes a rash, probably disseminated over the body, but also for infection acquired by the sexually associated route. Usually this rash can be in genital areas, and in that case you may imagine that it can be quite painful and quite sometimes also dangerous to people. And what was shown for 2022 that the disease still have a very small fatality rate, and sometimes it can be even resolved by itself. But what was shown that for HIV positive people, the fatality rate can be much larger, and in that case these people actually under larger danger comparing to other infected individuals. And that's why people pay more attention. And the first the discovery of disease was done in 1959, and it was done in captive monkeys that was imported to Copenhagen and Denmark. And because of that, the disease was coined by name of monkeypox. But actually, monkeys are not the only host for the disease, but actually people believe that maybe it can be transmitted also from rodents or other wildlife animals in Africa. But there is no exact answer to this question, and actually the exact host of the disease in wildlife animals is currently unknown. But because the disease is endemic in many areas in Africa, and that areas rodents, some particular rodents are endemic. So in that case, people sometimes link potential spread probably to rodents and possible spillovers to humans. And from 1970s, people started to see many outbreaks of mpox in Africa, and sometimes imported cases outside. But what was known that even this outbreak was seen, that the number, the maximum number of generations, so the maximum length of chains of transmissions were usually very small and very limited. And the maximal size of the chain that was recorded in 1970s up to 2000 was actually consistent of 5 infections. And in that case, it was the case of transmission from one family to another family. And there was one family where 3 children were infected, and then these children were admitted to the hospital, and during their stay to the hospital, another family was infected, and then 2 children was also infected. So in that case, the people hypothesized that there were 5 generations. But what people noticed that even if we had these 5 generations or less generations, then usually the disease after that would die out, and there would be no more transmission among people. And in that case, when this the generation of 5 was recorded, actually, as I said, the transmission to the second family was because of the stay of the first family in a hospital. And one particular way of transmission was that the syringes that was used for treatment at the time they were not replaced. So the same syringe could be used for the second family, and this could be the reason of transmission of mpox. Even now, the contaminated devices were recognized as one of the way of transmission of mpox. For example, in 2022, there was an outbreak in Spain in tattoo parlor, where the owner and also the devices were infected, contaminated by the infectious individual which uses tattoo salon. And at the time, the outbreak actually accounted for 22 individuals that were infected mainly by the contaminated devices. So it was known that there is this way of transmission by the contaminated devices. But as I said, even if people saw this, they still could not see many more transmission and very long chains of transmission. And by some reason, the disease always go to 0, and we didn't observe many other transmission chains. And the main driver for this was, as I said, kind of limited transmission potential, but also some cross protection from smallpox vaccination, that many people and many adults were also vaccinated against smallpox at the time, and that's why there was no real spillover of the disease from children to adults. It's not the case now, and that's why probably when we moved closer to 2000, we started to see many more outbreaks, and also many more importations from endemic countries to non-endemic countries. And one of the biggest outbreaks that was recorded before the global outbreak of 2022 was a multi-state outbreak of monkeypox in the US in 2003. And in that case, there was a shipment of animals from Ghana, and simply because these animals were stationed next to the pet animals, then these pet animals, prairie dogs, were infected, and finally the prairie dogs were purchased by people, and then there was a transmission from the pet animals to people. So finally it accounted for more than 71 cases that was linked to this outbreak, and you can see that it was the first outbreak that was quite large in scale, and it was outside of the endemic countries. And mainly you can see again kind of that the transmission of mpox by respiratory transmission route is very low. So mainly it's transmitted by the contact between infected and susceptible individual. And you can see that in that case some animals become infected. I have 10. And in that case, the animals become infected, then the children who usually played with this animal become infected because of the contact, and for example, the animals can bite them. And finally, when the children got infected, the parents would take care of them, then the parents would get infected. So it's kind of transmission potential for all this outbreak. But it was the largest one on record, and as I said, it accounted for 71 cases. But still, it was much lower than the number of cases we observed in 2022 because of the global outbreak. And the global outbreak of 2022, it was that big, mainly because the transmission potential associated with the sexual transmission route was much larger comparing to the non-sexual transmission route. And for example, in that paper, the researcher showed that the reproduction number accounted for the over the sexual network. You can see that it can exceed 1 quite fast. So if we assume that the secondary attack rate per sexually associated contact, even if it's very low, then this blue line can be above 1 quite rapidly. But for other transmission routes, the R naught is usually below 1, and sometimes it intersects just a little bit above 1 at the very end. So you can see that from this graph that actually the spillover from sexual network to non-sexual network can be considered very low, and that's why the mpox can be considered mainly driven by the sexual contact between individuals. And the spread here I show the map. You can see that the mpox spread quite a lot between different countries, but you can see that in our Western Pacific region there were not so many countries that reported the case, so only probably Republic of Korea, South Korea. And the main reason for this was that in 2022 actually we still have all COVID-19 restriction imposed, and also the travel between countries were restricted. But in Europe and in North America, in that case, travel pattern was recovered, and actually more and more people traveled, and also COVID-19 restrictions were much lower in intensity comparing to our region. And this could be one of the reasons why we didn't see many cases of mpox back in 2022. But this situation can be changed now because currently the COVID-19 restriction almost lifted, and also the travel restriction between different countries restored. And because of that, we indeed see increase of cases in many countries in our region. And for example, in Japan, just in recent weeks, we see the cases increasing, and probably we also see the beginning of a possible major outbreak in Japan. But it's not only in Japan, but also in Taiwan. We indeed see also many more cases. And again, I hope that you learn from my lecture today that here it's important word that is by date of onset. So indeed, even if we have here like the maximum 10, 11 cases and then 10 cases, and for example, on this week number 17, we had not so many cases, just 1 case. But simply we don't see many cases, probably because of many cases not yet reported. So again, I hope that one of the take-home messages from my lecture today would be for you that when you try to look on this data, you need to pay attention by characterization, and if you would see by date of onset, then you may automatically try to project the number of cases. And indeed, if you look on WHO website, then you would see that the reporting delay is about maybe 1 week. But currently in Taiwan, probably the outbreak is not recognized, and also because of the stigmatization of the disease and also privacy issues. Many people would prefer not to go to the hospital to get confirmed, so we may expect that the reporting delay can be even longer. So in that case, we may project that indeed there could be some other cases that are out there. So this is currently what is going on, and of course you can see some window of opportunity if you work in public health, try to analyze this outbreak and to look on what is going on. For example, Professor Christine tried to look if we would introduce some vaccination and look if some vaccination can be more efficient than the others. And it's what I wanted to tell you today. Sorry for very long talk. I was told that I can be slow, and finally I adopted the strategy and I become very slow probably. But summarizing my talk, what I wanted to say is that the emerging diseases would continue to pose a threat to the public health worldwide, and mainly it's because of increased frequency of contact between human population and wild animals, and also because of the climate change that poses more and more and increases the risk of spillovers. But also when we try to, because of the word emerging, we always arrive to some kind of point when we need to do some real-time analysis. And this is what I like to do in my research. And real-time analysis, actually it's quite, in my opinion, a bit fascinating, because in that case you may do this analysis, you may try to do some predictions and to do some nowcasting, but actually after that you can verify your predictions even without other people. So in that case it gives you some very convenient opportunity to validate and to look how precise you are and how well you do modeling, which cannot be done, for example, for retrospective analysis of the outbreak. Sometimes you also miss some details when you analyze outbreaks after, but during the real-time analysis you may follow some news and you may read more social media. In that case you kind of get engaged also in analyzing these outbreaks, simply if you're interested. And of course if you do this analysis you need to be interested in infectious disease, because it can be one of your motivation to do this research. But today I wanted also to outline that there are many challenges, and sometimes your data is not good enough, so you cannot really verify many complicated models. So in that case your methodology can be still in both ways simple and complicated. And then there are also a question how to implement this methodology and to account for different sources of the uncertainties. And a little bit about this uncertainty also Professor Jonathan Dushov talked last week, and today I try also to talk about it. And thank you for your attention, and I'm sorry for my long talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew, for the very comprehensive presentation. And because of time, I think if you have any question, please raise your hand immediately. Or any question on that? Okay, please.
Thank you for your talk. I'm sorry I was late because I couldn't find these buildings. So difficult for me to do that. Okay, I just wonder. I missed. Maybe you mentioned earlier, but I just missed probably. You mentioned that how can the likely increase the frequency of event due to climate change and the human population, which I understand, but I don't know why due to climate changes as well.
Yeah, for climate change, I would say one example can be dengue fever, that is more likely to be transmitted in more humid and warm environments. And actually there was a series of research work that shows that in the future, when we would expect more warm climate, in that case we have a higher threat for the dengue fever. So it's again another example. And because many outbreaks, they involve also vectors, so these vectors are affected by the climate change. And again, this dynamics of the vectors would sometimes more likely, more probable for more warm climates than now. So this is
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And Professor Lin, please.
So thank you for your wonderful talk. I have a very simple question. Today you mentioned lots of data or reported cases could be misunderstood, so that might affect your prediction or analysis. So I'm wondering, you mentioned in your previous slide, like about in 2021, the outbreak in Taipei. I'm wondering, how do you define the initial time? Because initially, there could be unreported cases going on, which could take a long time. Maybe it doesn't take long time. So it could be one case or could be the other. And how do you define and to define the initial time is sort of important, right? I mean, whatever the model, the mathematical model you chose, initial time that might affect, and then you have to adjust those coefficients in the model you chose, and that will decide how precise your prediction could be. So I'm wondering then how, in that case, I mean, how do you define the initial time?
So my response would be consist of two parts. I'm sorry. So the first part, for particular for that outbreak in 2021, you remember that at the time the level of compliancy and also the level of response from Taiwan CDC and from Taiwan government was quite high. So the contact tracing and active finding of cases were quite intense. And at the time, usually people who got infected, they would go first to get notified because they were afraid for some consequences. But also all close contacts would get tested. So in that case, the assortment of cases would be quite high. And at the time when the outbreak started, you probably remember there was this press conferences by Taiwan CDC, and actually during these conferences, they even provided the transmission network between these cases. And then if you work in this domain, and actually what I did is I collected every day snapshots of these transmission networks and look how they are reported. So by doing this, you can first of all make sure that all cases probably ascertained, and second, try to not to do mistakes and try to look if you do everything right. But by collecting those snapshots, you can estimate, for example, the reporting delay and try to predict a little bit of the future. So this was what was done by me and others, and also what was done during this outbreak. So it was quite convenient. If you look on Omicron, of course, then the assortment is much lower, and what you're saying, there is a big challenge about how to estimate the initial part. The second part of my response would be that when we try to estimate some quantities, for example, the reproduction number in that case, then there are different methods. And first method called like data-driven method, and in that case, actually, I try to fit my current reproduction number based on the previous few days. So based on my current data that I have. But if I use, for example, compartmental models like SIR, like susceptible and infectious recovered individuals, and if I use it in just naively, then I would try to fit all this epidemic curve at once to the data. So in that case, there could be some challenges how to adjust this bell-like curve to my data I have. So in that case, estimating like by using this data-driven approach, and for example, using some kind of, I'm sorry, maybe jumping a little bit, like convolution of previous cases by the generation time, could be more beneficial for this kind of exercise. So this is what was done, and in that case, the assortment, of course, it's still important, but it can be a little bit more robust for estimation.
Okay. I'm sorry because it's already 5 o'clock. I'm afraid I have to close the lecture. Thank you so much for your participation, and thank Dr. Andrea, and please give him a big applause.
thank you very much. And if you have question, you can write me on a mail. I will be happy to respond or to talk. Okay, thank you.